It's a reading from the Rex Harris book called Jazz, which was written in 1952, I think. So, yes, 1952. So some of the references are a bit out of date. But I suppose it's talking about the early jazz, so that will still be valid. And Rex Harris, he talks about jazz as being what come out of New Orleans, and that's now often called classic jazz, and he doesn't include in jazz swing or bebop or anything after that. So classic jazz is, I think it ends in Chicago as played by New Orleans Jazzmen. Anyway, this is chapter 5 from his book, and it's called The Pioneer Jazzmen. It says, "The conclusion has already been reached that if a new music or art form was to be born anywhere in the southern states of America, then it had to be New Orleans, by far the largest city south of St. Louis, and the entrepot of trade for the whole of the Gulf region and the Mississippi hinterland. We have seen how the atmosphere of this city was predominantly Latin, and Latin means those who used to speak the Latin language, which was Italy and in the main, and those it went to, like Spain and Portugal, I suppose. Anyway, that's what they call Latin. And that musical entertainment took an important part in everyday life. The cosmopolitan and Creole population were anxious to make their city as easy to live in as Paris of their ancestors, because the Creole people were supposed to be a mixture of African and French people, and they thought themselves superior, and perhaps they were, to the ordinary African Americans. And they were in the main more educated, and they could often read music where the African Americans couldn't. So they're trying to make the city as easy to live in as the Paris of their ancestors, and well, they succeeded. The Vieux Carré, or French Quarter, became a raw and lusty Montmartre. The centre of artistic and social life was the Opera House, where the Mardi Gras balls were held until 1919, when the building was burnt down. These Mardi Gras festivals were, and still are, part of a prolonged carnival season which lasts from Twelfth Night until Lent. After a hectic period of celebration and ceremony, the climax is reached on the eve of Ash Wednesday with a huge procession and the crowning of the King of Carnival. In 1949, Louis Armstrong was crowned king, and some idea of the honour which this title carried with it may be judged by Louis's words, "After that I'll be ready to die." New Orleans was indeed a happy city. The tolerance towards the Negroes was already been referred to. Processions, concerts, marches were indulged in at the slightest excuse, instigated by some society or lodge, akin to our Oddfellows, or even by a marching club, in which parades with a brass band and the organising of a funeral procession for a deceased member was the chief activity. Advertising by means of a band was also the custom in those days, more often than not on a wagon of some sort. The band would squeeze themselves on, the trombonist on the back pointing his instrument over the tailgate, and it was their duty to attract attention by creating as much noise as possible. Later on in this chapter will be mentioned the cutting contests which occurred when two rival bands met at perhaps a road junction. The bands would fight it out musically, the wagons often being tied together so that neither could escape until victory had been won by one or the other. A survival of the fittest and a feat of endurance indeed. When it is considered that New Orleans is a city about the size of Bristol, he's talking about 1952, size of Bristol no more, some assessment can be made of the way in which life was really lived to the full. Here was the spawning ground of jazz. What more natural than that a new musical way of expression should find a definitive form when there was a demand for so much music? When so much latent talent among the Negro musicians was straining for self-expression, with nothing but their own instincts to guide them, for hardly one could read music. That's what I just said, that it was the Creoles who could read the music, not the Negroes. When quality of performance reached a high standard, forced upward and still upward by dint of cutthroat rivalry, and when ultimate success brought with it a popularity and prestige comparable with that of Babe Ruth or a Dennis Compton. And I think Babe Ruth, if I know, was a great baseball player. And Dennis Compton, I remember from my youth, was a great cricket batsman. So, an example from America and an example from the UK, or England as we often call it. We enter then into the formative years of classic jazz, when the music took its final shape. The rest of this book is mainly an account of jazzmen who played in this shape. The music was never written down. The exponents themselves drifted into obscurity more often than not, so that the majority of the early history has been handed down from mouth to mouth. Or perhaps mouth to ear. Nevertheless, we are able to piece together the main facts about the pioneers of New Orleans who created their music between 1890 and 1920. And in so doing, in writing an account of the activities of Manuel Perez, Buddy Bolden, John Robiou, Freddie Keppard and Kid Ory, we are at the same time explaining how the many fragments of influence were finally welded together to form the whole, jazz, or classic jazz as he likes it. Of this short list of early jazzmen, that of Buddy Bolden was certainly the best known name, if only because of his spectacular, almost lurid career. A legend had been built around the name of Bolden, mainly through the romantic account of the pages of Jazzmen, as a magazine, extracts of which are quoted later in this chapter. And this legend of the barber of Franklin Street has impinged itself upon the world of jazz knowledge to such an extent that little or no attention has been paid to one who was, in all probability, a greater cornet player, a much better all-round jazzman, and one who certainly influenced many more than did Bolden. And that person was Manuel Perez. And it's like a footnote, it says also spelt Emmanuel Perez. Manuel Perez, born 1873, could have been successful in any field of music if social conditions had allowed, for he was an excellent both as a reader and as a teacher. He played with John Robiou in the very early days, around 1895, but in 1898 formed his own band, the Imperial, along with Alphonse Picot, and later organised the magnificent Onward Band. In an interview with Robert Goffin, both Picot and Louis Nelson, confirmed emphatically that Perez was the first jazz trumpeter. Nelson, in fact, was able to give more positive proof to the claim. He produced a newspaper cutting about his father's death in 1900 and remembered that he was playing then with Buddy Baldwin, who at that time not only did not have his own orchestra, but was only playing an accordion and making his first attempts on the trumpet. Bud Scott says about Perez, a great trumpet player and a jazzman, everything any way you pick it, he could do it, all the tricks. These testimonies must have taken as of at least equal importance to those of Bunk Johnson, who, because he played with Baldwin, may be expected to have shown a little bias in Buddy's favour. Undoubtedly both the Imperial and the Onward were the magnificent marching bands. The Onward probably the greatest of all the New Orleans marching bands, and one held in an esteem approaching reverence by most New Orleans musicians who can remember it. Sorry about the interruption. I just had the doorbell ring for the man who's been laying our lawn for us, ready to move. We're trying to move down to Cardiff. So eventually all these bits will be from Cardiff, and hopefully, I'm hopeful anyway, that I'll be able to get in or form a band of my own down there, which is quite difficult for me here. But we'll see. Cardiff, opportunities for success or failure. There we go. Perez led his marching bands right up until the general exodus from the south. There was no exciting incidents in his life which served to preserve the memory of the Onward band. Compared with most other New Orleans jazzmen, his habits were temperate and he led a quiet life. Moving north even before Oliver, that's King Oliver, Joe Oliver, his band, which played at the Peking Cabaret in Chicago, consisted of Picard clarinet, A. Des Verney trombone, Frank Haney piano, Ed Garland bass. The band was as talented and renowned as the Oliver group, but it so happened that Oliver made the first records, thereby staking an unimpeachable claim to fame, whilst Perez returned to his native New Orleans, having saved enough money to start a grocery business. Because you can't make a living out of jazz in the main. Not possible. If the collectors who still search for the fabulous Baldwin cylindrical record shift their attention to the possible and more probable recorded evidence of Perez, they will be searching for something of greater historical importance, and they will stand a greater chance of success. For Perez lived through a period of more recording activity, when a different temperament, a more striking personality like Baldwin, Perez could have become King Perez. Yet even in 1945, when Eugene Williams wished to speak to him, he shunned publicity of any sort, claimed he was ill and refused even an interview. And there have been no recent reports as to whether he was well again or whether he was alive or dead. So that's quite a telling thing, really, that you've got to make an impression, not just be a good musician. During his career, he received acclaim and respect wherever he played, yet as fine a musician was never honoured in New Orleans by the royal title, that's King. This recognition fell to Charles Baldwin, 1868 to 1931, nicknamed Buddy King Buddy, Kid, and finally King Bolden. And most handed-down accounts and many first-hand witnesses are definite on the point that if musical personality is deemed a passport to investiture, Buddy was entitled to his crown. Because of this personality, a great deal of the way in which he played and lived has been remembered, and through these memories can be gleaned a reasonable, true picture of the colourful life of the New Orleans jazz at the turn of the century. Bunk Johnson, who has related so much to our generation of the early history of jazz, says, "Buddy could not read a note, but he surely played a good stiff lead and would have you in maybe 6 sharps before you finished. But I could always go anywhere the king went. We played parades and advertising wagons, and excuse me for the expression, honky-tonks, and together we made famous blues, until the king went crazy and we killed all the other best bands in New Orleans." But as you say, Bunk Johnson was played with him and he was probably somewhat biased. At that time, towards the end of the 19th century, the important bands of the Crescent City were Adam Oliver, the Golden Rule, Bub Russell, and Jean Robichaud. The last name was the most prominent, playing in a more legitimate style, and capable of providing the musical accompaniment for both open-air concerts and polite society balls. And at the time Bolden entered the scene was at Antoine's Restaurant and the Grenoble, later the Roosevelt. Robichaud's band was accomplished in playing the dance music of the period, quadrilles, cakewalks, and square dances, and the band contained many famous hot players at the time. Robichaud might be compared with Fletcher Henderson of a later period in jazz. The fact that he played a good deal of straight dance music did not necessarily result in his contemptuous dismissal as a sweet band. Manuel Perez, Lorenzo Tito, Baptiste Delise, and Bud Scott played with Robichaud, and these men, while lacking Bolden's scintillating personality perhaps, could hardly be described as mediocre. Indeed, Bud Scott has said that on occasion, in one of the many cutting contests in Lincoln Park, Robichaud came out the winner. But this was not often, and Scott gives full credit to Bolden for his dynamic execution. He says, "Bolden was still a great man for the blues, no question about that. The closest thing to it was Oliver, and he was better than Oliver. He was a great man for what we call dirt music. Let me tell you, he was plenty powerful. Even with all that power, the trumpet players of that day would have their notes covered, and they would not hurt the ear the way rebop does now. You could hear every instrument in the bands, and the drummer had his drums tuned. You would tune the drums like they were a piano." Buddy Bolden was a barber in Franklin Street, and in addition to leading his band, he seemed to have been quite a character, publishing a gossip and scandal sheet called The Cricket, in which stories gleaned from New Orleans' lower life found print. It is highly probable that Bolden's personality did much to ensure his supremacy over the other trumpeters. It must be borne in mind that in those days there was no radio, no gramophone, no high-powered publicity, and no booking agencies. A musician had to succeed on the strength of his reputation, ability, and personality alone. Buddy played at places like the Tintype Hall, the Perseverance Hall, and the Longshoremen's Hall, for such nefarious organisations as the Mysterious Babies and the Buzzards. He played regularly at the Johnson Park, not far from the Lincoln Park where Robbie Show played, and it was here that Bobby used to call his chillin' home. If he arrived at Johnson Park late, when the prospective audience was over in Lincoln listening to Robbie's show, he would stick his cornet through the fence and blow like mad until Lincoln Park was empty and the crowd was in Johnson Park listening to the King. At this time, in the early 1890s, Bolden's band consisted of William Warner or Frank Lewis on clarinet, Willie Cornish, valve trombone, Jeff Mumford guitar, James Johnson bass, and Cornelius Tillman drums. Later on, Bunk Johnson joined the band as a second cornet. Frank Dewson was the trombonist, Bob Lyons bass, Sam Dutry clarinet, Henry Baltimore drums, and Jimmy Paolo on violin. In the early band, Cornish was the only one who could read music, and the presence of Paola in the later band is probably explained for the same reason. For Bolden was unique in that he scorned written notation and even the desire to learn the notes. He fashioned his music according to his own creed, which was to overprint his personality and inspiration of the moment onto the traditional basis of the march and dance music which he played. Cornish, having learnt the new numbers, passed them on to the rest of the band, and then after Buddy had finished with it, it was Bolden's jazz music, though of course the term jazz was as yet unknown in this context. Once again, to quote Bunk Johnson in his letter to Fred Ramsey, printed in the Jazzmen, here is the thing that made King Bolden Band be the first band that played jazz. It was because it did not read at all. I could fake like 500 myself, so you tell them that Bunk and King Bolden's band was the first ones that started jazz in the city or any place else. In his rough and ready way, Bolden and his band had discovered the vital clue to the embryo music which was maturing into jazz. By force of circumstance, they were compelled to improvise. By the hand of fate, they were inspired enough not only to emulate their academic contemporaries, but by sheer brilliance to forge further ahead and crystallize a new musical art form. It was during Bolden's reign that the notorious Storyville was created, named after the alderman who drew up the necessary civic regulations. It consisted of an area off the French Quarter which was designated a legal red light district. The Crescent City had always been notorious for its tolerance to an extreme waywardness. It had once sent an SOS to Paris for a consignment of good women because all the female population were bad. But even those who had known New Orleans in its early days could not have condoned the practices which obtained around Iberville, Franklin and Basin streets. Already known for political corruption and vice in general, Storyville became a showplace of the city and the scandal of the whole South and indeed America. Organised prostitution has never been conducted in such a grandiose manner, nor at such a sordid level. Tom Anderson was boss of Storyville. In addition to running the Arlington Annex, he published the 25-cent Blue Book, which was a brothel Baedeker. I think Baedeker is an American like telephone directory or something. A directory of all the prostitutes and sporting houses. It carried advertisements from the ornate places of joy like Lulu White's Mahogany Hall, Countess Willie Piazza's place, which specialised in octoroons. An octoroon is a person having 1/8 Negro blood. And Josie Arlington's $5 house. Starting life in 1897, there were in 1910 200 houses of pleasure in the district, and not until the date when Billy Phillips decided to go one better than the others, replacing the single pianist in his 101 ranch by a whole band playing regularly. Did jazz really move into Storyville? This point is mentioned here as one of some importance. Jazz may have flourished in the gutter, but it was not born there, and it took to the gutter because the pavement ostracised it. Bolden himself, playing in the previous decade, performed mainly in club halls, at open-air concerts and in marches, and did not rely on vice for a livelihood. This is not to whitewash Buddy, who loved women at all times and in great numbers, but to underline the fact that jazz was not born in the honky-tonk. It went there because it provided work with remuneration. If society boards had been such that they required Bolden's powerful cornet instead of the string quartets, then jazz would have flourished in the dicty houses of class among the New Orleans upper set. Whatever theories we may hold as to the origins of the music, the fact remains that jazz, like any other art, has followed its sponsors. In the Middle Ages, Michelangelo and Raphael painted for their sponsors the church, but their Florentine art was eclipsed when the merchant class of Venice sponsored Titian and Giorgione. Similarly, jazz went to the Vice District when it offered regular and well-paid employment, and moved on to Chicago, St. Louis, and Los Angeles when Storyville closed down. Bolden sailed through his musical career in the most enviable of fashions. All the girls flocked around him on marches when it was a privilege to indeed an honour to be honoured as a coat carrier, and sometimes in dance halls he was mobbed in true Bobby Soxer tradition. And the Bobby Soxers were the ones who chased after Frank Sinatra. That's where that was phrased. And I think they're little ankle socks that kids wear. But women and overwork eventually went to his head, literally. The man who could blow his horn so loudly that he could be heard 2 miles away on the quiet night finally went insane in a spectacular manner at a Mardi Gras carnival, and was committed to the East Louisiana State Hospital in 1907, where he died in 1931. Of course, he was in there a long time. Completely unknown and unwanted by the world at large, but not forgotten by such as Jelly Roll Morton, who in 1939 sang, "I thought I heard Buddy Bolden say, 'You're nasty but you're dirty, take it away. You're terrible, you're awful, take it away. I thought I heard him say.'" And strangely enough, it wasn't just Jelly Roll Morton who sang that, but Buddy Bolden sung it as well. Thank you.